Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm glad to see that so many people could make it. My name is Erica Eisen, and I am the coordinator of the Writing and Academic Resource Center, or WARC for short. With me also is Maria Antonova, who's the director of the WARC. Today, the topic of the presentation, as I'm sure you guys know, is how to write a literature review. I should say before we get started that earlier today, my power went out, which obviously caused my internet to go out. So it's fixed now, and I hope it doesn't happen again. But I just want to warn you, if I suddenly disappear, that's why. All right, so let me get screen sharing started, and then we can begin. One moment, please. Okay, so you guys should now see my screen. Let me make it full screen so it looks nice. All right, so how to write a literature review. So we know that the deadline for a lot of senior thesis writers' literature reviews is coming up, which is why we timed the presentation when we did. But we hope that this presentation will be useful, not just for senior thesis writers or MAT students, but for the broader student body as well. So if you are a younger student, it's great that you're here, and I encourage you to stay. One other note I would make before diving in is that we did give a very similar talk last year, and the recording is on our YouTube page. So if you've seen that, there is a good bit of repeated material, but there is also some new stuff. So I would encourage you to stick around because there is stuff that I've added to hopefully make things clearer and reinforce points a little bit. All right, so let's begin. All right, so what is a literature review? Why are you writing a literature review in the first place? So a literature review, accomplishes several tasks. It does several things. Number one, it provides an overview, a summary of previous scholarship related to your topic, and helps your reader understand what other people have already said about this topic. It engages critically with that scholarship, meaning it doesn't just say, oh yes, this is correct because I've read it somewhere and someone has written it, but it analyzes it and says, is that correct? Is there something missing? That kind of thing. We'll go over this more in a minute. And it shows your reader what your research will add. This goes back to the fundamental point, which is that your thesis or your essay should be making an original contribution to the scholarship. And so in order to help your reader understand that, you have to help them understand, again, what has already been said and what has not been said, right? And hopefully what your thesis is going to be adding is an answer to, what has not been said yet, questions that have been unanswered or even unasked. All right, so before you begin, please check, this is very important. Do you have a good, solid research question? If you do not, there's no point in writing a literature review because it can't possibly be good, right? You need to have a good research question, not just a topic, not just a general idea of what might be nice to write about. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to be going over what makes a good, solid research question today, because we have done that before. Oh, I don't know why that's not showing up at length. So before you begin, please check, do you have a strong research question? If not, here's the QR code to a talk that we gave that explains at length what a good research question is and how you can make one. Do you know how to find good scholarly sources? If you don't, you can't write a literature review because you won't be able to find the literature. So here is the QR code to a recent talk that we gave that explains all about this in depth. And lastly, do I know how to paraphrase, cite, and avoid plagiarism? Obviously, in a literature review, you're going to be talking a lot about other people's ideas. And in order to do that correctly and in an academically honest way, you're going to need to be doing a lot of paraphrasing, probably less quoting, but some quoting. And you always need to avoid plagiarism, right? So this is, again, the QR code to a talk that we gave on that topic. So I invite you, if you need review on these topics, to please scan these and maybe tune in later, because These are really critical skills that you need to have before you even begin your literature review. Okay, so what is the structure of a literature review? What should it look like? Well, you'll probably have an introduction. It doesn't need to be that long. It doesn't have to be that formal, where you'll briefly reintroduce the focus of your research. Then you'll have summary and comparisons of the articles you've read, right? What have other scholars said about this topic? What other methods have been applied, research methods or theories? How do these ideas and articles relate to each other? Are these sort of basically all agreeing? Are there different schools of thought? How do they interact? And you're going to analyze, right? This goes back to the point about engaging critically with the scholarship, not just agreeing with everything. So do you disagree with any of the conclusions that the authors have made? Maybe they're misinterpreting their data, or they have a bias that is maybe betraying, or that is maybe guiding their logic in an incorrect direction. Do you think that their methodology was flawed? So maybe their questions in the survey that they asked participants were biased, or they only asked a certain type of people, and yet they are making generalizations about the entire population. These might be flaws. Is there an aspect of the topic that still has not been studied? So, we're going to shortly be looking at a sample senior thesis that was written by a student, and the student is writing about stress in young people, in adolescents, teenagers. And one of the points that they make is that a lot of the research on stress has been done on adults, and that teenagers have been less studied, right? So, maybe you are applying an old way of seeing to new material. And then some conclusion, where you restate your research question in light of your analysis. Okay, so before you begin writing, let's do some preparation. The first thing, make a list of keywords and phrases that you might need to define. So these might be technical terms that are really important for your readers to understand. They may also be words that are not necessarily technical, but are defined in a really specific way for the purposes of research. You're going to find relevant sources, right? So, of course, you're going to be doing good scholarly research using not just a Google search, but tools like JSTOR, like Google Scholar. Again, if you don't know what these are, please check out my earlier presentation on finding and evaluating sources. And you're going to summarize and analyze as you read. Please do this as you read and not after you read, because you're going to forget, right? So take careful notes. Think about how these authors are speaking to each other. Think about scholarship as a conversation, right? People are debating, maybe agreeing, maybe disagreeing, right? You need to be able to understand the relationship between different articles and different authors in order to be able to present a literature review that makes sense. And then you're going to decide on groupings. How am I going to group things? How am I going to present all that I've read and all that I've researched to my readers? So the first thing you should decide is which sources are most relevant, which will you exclude? As frustrating as it is, oftentimes you might read, or at least begin to read, an academic article thinking, oh, this title makes it sound perfect. It's absolutely a great fit for my research. And then you start reading and you realize that actually it's not so relevant. Or maybe your focus changes and what was once relevant is no longer relevant, right? So a literature review is not an exhaustive list, a complete list of everything you've read, right? You're going to exclude some things. And of course, there are some sources that you might want to emphasize, some that are super important, right? You might do a chronological grouping. This is a possible grouping, right? So if there has been change over time in how people have understood a certain concept, or interpreted something, then a chronological framing might make sense. Maybe thematic, right? So instead of looking at how things have changed over time, looking at different aspects of it. Or maybe methodological. So some people might have done experiments, some people might have done surveys, some people might have taken an anthropological approach. That might be a way of looking at it methodologically. All right, so once you have all of this, of course, your task is going to be summarizing your sources so that your reader understands what the state of the literature is, what other people have said. Right, so some questions you might want to be asking yourself as you're summarizing and explaining all of this is, what do earlier scholars conclude? What data have they found that is relevant to my topic? What methodologies did they use? What key terms or special vocabulary are relevant to my topic, right? These terms that you might need to define or explain. And some key phrases that you might use as you're summarizing this research would be things like, previous research has shown that something, author argues that something, author's findings suggest that something, author concludes that something, prior studies have demonstrated that something, many studies have examined something, earlier researchers have applied some methodology to this topic, and some scholars have found that, right? So this are some phrases you might use as you're trying to summarize an article or articles that you have read. Okay, another task that is important to the literature review is comparing and contrasting, right? This goes back to the idea I was talking about earlier, that it's really important to understand the relationships between the authors and their ideas. So how are their ideas, their conclusions, and their approaches similar or different? Are there debates surrounding this topic? Maybe it's really divisive and everybody either thinks one thing or another thing. Are there different schools of thought into which authors can be divided? That's sort of a similar point. And some key phrases here would be, so if you're describing similar positions, both author 1 and author 2 agree that, something. You can use the word similarly, blah, 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 blah. Or author of study 1's findings support author of study 2's claims that something, right? So here, these studies are saying similar or the same things, right? And you want to point that out. What about different positions? These are some phrases we can use. Scholars disagree about some topic, right? To introduce the fact that there is disagreement. Studies about some topic offer conflicting results. There's currently no consensus, no agreement on something. Unlike author 1, author 2 says something or argues that. And then by contrast, other scholars have found that something, right? So these are some key phrases that you can use when you go beyond merely summarizing and on to pointing out the relationships between different articles or books. All right, so now the task of analyzing sources. What do I mean by that? Analyzing sources means analyzing what are the potential biases of the authors. Is a particular group under or overrepresented? Could be a gender, it could be a racial or ethnic group or religious group, etc. An age group. Are there survey or interview questions biased, right? Do they interpret their data correctly? So maybe, everything up to the interpretation part is correct, but they're leaving something out. They're not considering other explanations for whatever phenomenon they observe. And do you disagree with any of the conclusions that other scholars have made, right? Maybe this is similarly, like maybe you disagree with their conclusions, and you should say that. You don't have to agree with everything that you read, and indeed you shouldn't. And I think lastly, do you think that their methodology is flawed? So this, similar point here, right? Oh, so there's more. Is there an aspect of the topic that has still not been studied? This goes back to the point I was making earlier, that you should make clear to your readers, how your research contributes in a novel way, in a new and original way to the academic conversation, right? You are, in your research, adding something new. And part of that means identifying and pointing out what has not been studied, has not been researched, etc. Right, so some key phrases here for some critical points. Author does not consider something. Author fails to account for something. Author assumes that something. Some group are over or underrepresented in the sample. Author's claim is not supported by the evidence. And author's theory is not consistent with the subsequent research, right? So these are phrases that you might use in order to make some analytical remarks, some critical remarks about what you've read, to point out some issues, some flaws, some things that can be improved upon. All right, so I want to expand on identifying gaps in the body of scholarship. We talked a little bit about that in the last slide, but what can you add to the scholarly conversation, right? Is there an aspect of the topic that still has not been studied? Ideally, your research fits in perfectly to that gap, right? Can you apply existing methods or theories to a new case, right? So this, in the example I was talking about earlier, this student has written a thesis about stress in teenagers, right? And they're applying existing methods that were used to study stress in adults to a new case, in this case, a different age group. And some phrases that you can use here, right? However little is known about. So, much has been researched about stress in adults. However little is known about how stress manifests in younger people, etc. Something is understudied. Something remains poorly understood. It is not known how, what, why, whatever, something. Scholars have yet to examine something. These ideas have never been applied to a certain example or case. One area that has not been researched is something. And then building upon earlier research, I will do something, right? So this is very explicitly building a connection between what you have outlined in your literature review, i.e. the earlier scholarship, and what you will do in your own thesis or your own essay, whatever it may be. Okay, so I want to include some grammar points here because these are mistakes that I see often, and they do come up a lot, specifically in literature reviews, although certainly not only. Okay, so in English or any language, so a direct question is an actual question, something like, what time is it? Question mark. What is your name? Question mark, right? These are real questions you're asking, unless it's a rhetorical question, because you want to know the answer, right? In English, they use a special word order. They use inverted word order, right? The verb comes before the subject, right? So when I say, my name is Erica, the subject, my name, comes before the verb is. Russian speakers, please remember that to be is a verb. Whereas in the question, what is your name, is comes before your name, right? So this is an inverted word order, a special word order. So why does this happen? Might be an example. Is this method effective? How does pollution affect mental health? So, some fake example of a thesis, for example. An indirect question is not an actual question. It is a statement related to questions, statements related to what people have asked, that kind of thing. In English, they don't use this inverted word order. They go back to regular word order, just like a normal statement. So for example, many scholars have tried to explain why this happens, right? So here we say, why does verb this happen? Here, we don't say, why does this happen? We say, why this happens, right? I see this mistake a lot with non-native English speakers. They might say something like, many scholars have tried to explain, why does this happen, right? We need to remember that in indirect questions, we go back to a more statement-like word order. Let's look at another example. Scientists do not know if this method is effective, right? So is this method effective becomes if or whether this method is effective, right? So this method, subject is verb, subject verb, this very regular word order. And then the last one, this paper will examine how pollution affects mental health, right? So it goes from how does pollution affect mental health to how pollution affects mental health. All right. So just to make it a bit clearer, if we have a statement like my name is Erica, the purple one is the subject, the green one is the verb, and this yellow one is the question word. The direct question would be, what is your name? So you can see that the purple and the green switch places. And then the indirect question, he asked me what my name was, right? So we can see that we have the question word, and then the subject, and then the verb. Or a more academic one that's less, facile. Students feel stress. Okay, so subject, verb. The direct question, why? Question word, do. This is auxiliary verb. Students feel stress, right? And then the indirect question related to that might be the study examined why, question word, students, subject, feel stress, right? So I bring this up and I maybe belabor the point a bit because in a literature review, you're going to be explaining a lot about what people researched, what people concluded, why things happen, etc. And these are all, calling for you to use indirect questions. So at the risk of belaboring the point, it is quite an important grammar point for this particular type of assignment. Okay. All right. So another grammar point I want to make here briefly is uncountable nouns. So in English, we have a special type of nouns called uncountable nouns or mass nouns. These nouns often refer to like a class of objects or an abstract concept, and we have some special rules that we need to follow when we use them. Specifically, we don't use plural forms with them. We don't use a or an with them. We don't use words like many, which you have to use a plural with that anyway. We don't use few, and we don't use numbers. So words like, let me give an example, furniture, right? Furniture is a general type of thing. It's a general category. We can't in English say furnitures. That's incorrect. Nor can we say a furniture. Nor can we say many furnitures or few furnitures. We can't say two furnitures, right? We can only use the word furniture singular. So we use singular forms, furniture. We can say a piece of, right? So instead of saying just a, we can say a piece of furniture. Much furniture sounds a little bit odd. Little furniture also sounds a little bit odd. But the point is that these are the singular equivalents of many and few. All right, so uncountable nouns you might need to use in your literature review, or for that matter, any kind of academic research include information, knowledge, advice, evidence, proof, research, and feedback. So I hear a lot of mistakes related to these words. And so I wanted to clarify this point here. I think it's certainly relevant beyond the bounds of the literature review, but I thought it was as good a place to clarify this point as any. So for example, incorrect. There are no proofs for this theory. We cannot use the word proof in the plural. It is a uncountable noun. So we would say instead, correct. There is no proof for this theory. So we just changed it to singular, and that's a very simple fix. Wrong. Other scholars have made researches on this topic. I see so many Russian speakers saying made researches or make researches. Correct. Other scholars have conducted research on this topic. So first of all, we don't say research in the plural. We always use it in the singular. But also we don't say make research in English. We either say do research or conduct research. And then a last example, one evidence for the hypothesis is something. So right, we can't use numbers with these types of words. Instead, we can use this handy phrase, a piece of. So one piece of evidence or one piece of proof, for example, for the hypothesis is. So, these are words here that are likely to come up somewhere in your thesis. If not in your literature review, then somewhere else. So I hope that this is helpful. And I hope that it clarifies an English grammar point that I think a lot of non-native speakers struggle with. Just gonna let me move. All right, so let's look at an actual student literature review. First of all, I encourage all of you, if you haven't already, and if you're struggling to write your literature review, to simply Google literature review examples. A lot of universities have posted examples of literature reviews, from their students that they think are good and that they want other students to use as a model, as an example of what a literature review should look like and what it can be. So I did this search. I should say it's student work. It's not perfect. There are some grammar errors, but I didn't fixate on that. All right, so this is the opening of the literature review, and I've highlighted this sentence. As I mentioned before, this is about how students, how adolescents, how teenagers respond to stress. So this first couple of sentences. The biological, psychological, and social effects of stress on an individual have been researched extensively over time. Only recently has literature begun to focus on the influence stress has on young people during the vulnerable stage of adolescence. Okay, so I'm going to ask people to raise their hand. We've been talking a lot about what should be included in a literature review, the different parts of the literature review. If just looking at these two sentences, what is the student doing here? What is the role of these two sentences? How can we identify them? Does anyone have an idea?
Maybe the introduction.
Right, it's an introduction. And specifically, what is the introduction doing?
Introducing the whole idea of the literature review.
Right, and Fakhrola raised his hand.
I think not only that piece of the introduction, but also I think trying to show a gap there as well. Like
Show what,
there
sorry?
has been gap.
Show a gap. Right, so this is, this point here, only recently has literature begun to focus on the influence of stress on young people, right? So this is, saying that there has been an emphasis on the research on adults, and there has been relatively little on young people. So it is showing a gap. And obviously, this thesis is going to help to fill that gap. So it is immediately in the first sentence defining not just the topic, although it does do that, but also the importance, right? Because it's showing what original contribution this work is making. Did anybody else have something to say? Yeah, so what I thought that this opening did well is it explains the state of the research, right? How much research has been done. There has been extensive research, but it's changed over time, right? There's been a relative lack, right? So thank you guys. All right, so what about the end here? So moving on in this paragraph, it says this paper will specifically focus on the types of life stressors young people encounter and the coping strategies they implement. Also to be examined is how adolescent stressors and coping strategies differ to that of adults. Through a review of relevant coping literature, the notion of coping as a dynamic process will be emphasized. There's some, I think this is Irish, so this is some Irish grammar here, but grammar and spelling, but whatever. So what role do these sentences play? What is the student doing here?
Concluding sentence here. The author is concluding the phrase. Oh, paragraph, I mean.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The author is concluding the paragraph, I think, because these are concluding sentences.
They are concluding, but they're doing more than just concluding. What else are they doing? What is the role of these sentences?
Maybe the author wants to emphasize the importance of this paper from different points of view, because he just has focus on types of life of stresses.
So I don't think the author is emphasizing the importance of the paper, but I do think that they're providing a summary of what their thesis will focus on, right? So this paper will focus on blah, 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 blah. So this is sort of a summary of what the thesis is going to be about. It continues on in the next sentence. So this sentence basically restates the research question. And in this final sentence, they mention some kind of emphasis that is going to be found in the literature review. So they show the reader what to expect, right? So here, what did I put? Explanation of the thesis's focus, right? So, and what we can learn, what we can expect, excuse me, from the literature review. I should say, the reason I'm asking these questions to you guys is that when you read examples of other writing, if you're having trouble structuring your own writing, read these other examples and think, what is the purpose of the sentence? What is it accomplishing? From that, you can get ideas for how you can transfer that structure onto your own writing, right? So if I know, okay, one way to begin a literature review is to, talk about the general state of the research and point out what's missing. You can apply that to your own research question, right? Which is probably not about stress in adolescence, right? So when we analyze what role these sentences are playing, we can then apply that lesson to our own writing, even if it's on a different topic. All right, so let's look at more examples. Okay, so two more here that are playing a similar role to each other. So these authors explain stress using a biopsychosocial approach, suggesting that stressful reactions affect the emotional, psychological, and cognitive state of an individual. This definition describes stress as a reaction. So these people define stress this way. Alternatively, Caltabiano, Serafino, and Byrne, these authors, view stress as a discrepancy, right? So here, what is happening? Oops, so here we have a contrast, right? So these people define it this way. Alternatively, so here's a signaling word. These people define it another way. Here we have a comparison. So these authors suggest coping focuses on achieving goals. Similarly, signal phrase, these ones describe coping as a relationship, right? So, here are some examples that you can look at to see how another student not only summarized the research they read, but also made a connection between them using these linking words like alternatively, which shows a contrast, or similarly, which shows a similarity. Okay, so here, what do we have? The student is continuing. They are describing some study, and then they say, this data was based on a sample of adolescents aged 12 to 13. Thus, it is possible the stressors could differ to those encountered by an older sample. The article was also relatively dated, meaning it's old, right? 1991. Therefore, it is possible that the types of stressors prevalent today have changed. So here, what is the author doing? They are critically analyzing the past scholarship. They're noting that it might be out of date, and they're noting that the age group is relatively limited, right? So this finding probably can't be, or maybe can't be applied to people who are 16, 17, who might have very different stresses, very different problems, right? So this is an example of how a student can do that critical analysis that I was talking about earlier, right? Looking at things like, is a piece of research old and maybe needs to be updated? Is the sample size limited, or is it maybe not applicable to the particular group that I want to study? Okay, let's look at a couple more examples. So here is a paragraph. These authors conducted a multicultural analysis of adolescent stressors and found blah, 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 blah. Similar to them, they suggest that adolescents are increasingly concerned about school, future employment, and further education. Comparison of these studies indicate that time has not significantly altered types of stressors adolescents experience. Okay, so what is going on here? So the first thing I think the students does well is they summarize the findings of past research in their own words, right? So in this sentence, they're summarizing what this study found in their own words. Then what are they doing? They're making a comparison of findings, just like we were talking about earlier. They use this word similar to, and they make a connection, right? So they're drawing connections between authors. Another thing I thought was really good is that they took that a step further and they said, okay, this study was in 2012, this study was in 2000, and this study was in 1991. So 20 years between these studies, and they're all finding basically the same things. From that, I'm going to conclude that actually time has not really changed the results of these studies, right? So they're making some analysis. This time they're not being critical in the sense of making a criticism, but they are, making some kind of judgment based upon what they see. Okay, this next one, the highly influential work of so-and-so emphasize the role of blah, 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 blah. So here, I think the student does a good job of explaining the importance of a particular piece of research, right? So sometimes there is a work that is super important. Every article you read cites it. It might be useful to make that clear to your readers, right? By saying something like, this work is highly influential, this work is widely cited or widely read, etc. That might be a good thing for your readers to know. Okay, so what I want you guys to take away from this is first, please read past examples of literature reviews. They are going to be really helpful to you. Second, please read them actively. Please think, what is the structure that this student is using? What is the role of this sentence? What kind of connection words are they using, like similarly, etc., that I can use in my own writing? How are they drawing connections between different authors? And how can I take some inspiration from that? What kind of faults or flaws are they pointing out? And can I maybe see the same faults or flaws in some of the articles that I'm reading, right? So please, please, please read actively. The last point I want to make is that in all of the examples I pointed out, there's a lot more paraphrasing than there is quoting, right? So this student is really, condensing what they've read, a whole article, which is maybe 20 pages, into just one sentence, right? So this skill of paraphrasing is super important. And again, if you guys are unsure about it, I encourage you to watch the anti-plagiarism workshop that Maria led on our YouTube page. But this is a skill that you're going to be using a lot, and I encourage you to brush up on it if you're not confident in your abilities in that respect. Okay, so other things to consider as you're preparing to write and as you are writing your research, your literature review, excuse me. First, as you take notes, please make sure that you are clearly differentiating your paraphrases from quotes. So sometimes when people are taking notes, they read a paragraph and then they summarize it in their own words. And then they read another part and they're like, oh, that's a great quote. I'm going to copy paste that into my notes. If you don't clearly mark the difference between when you're summarizing in your own words and when you're quoting, that's going to spell some trouble for you later on because you might not remember which was which. This is a great recipe for accidental plagiarism. And, accidental plagiarism is punished just the same as deliberate plagiarism because of course the professor can't tell the difference, right? So please, please, please make sure that it's very clear in your note-taking when you're, finding a quote that maybe you want to use later and when you are actually summarizing. Okay, and lastly, this applies in everything you write for your college classes, not just the literature review, but it goes without saying. And this student did it very well. Please use proper citation. Please, please, please don't forget it. That is also a recipe for accidental plagiarism, right? Forgetting to use the citation. Okay, if you're stuck, right? Sometimes you hit a roadblock, you don't know what to do next. The first piece of advice I always give is know that you don't have to write from beginning to end. I say this as someone who never writes from the beginning to end, right? So sometimes you get to the middle and you don't know what the next paragraph should be, but you actually have an idea about what the ending should be. Please feel free to go skip to the end, write that, you know what your conclusion should look like. You can come back to that middle part later, right? You're still making progress. You don't have to just stay stuck. Or you can try switching to a different type of task, right? So maybe instead of writing, you're going to go back to researching and reading and taking notes. And that's going to refresh your mind for the task of writing when you return to it later on. Maybe you can talk to your advisor, right? And maybe your peers can help. Other people who are writing theses, maybe they have some insights, right? Something that they've learned or some good examples of, literature reviews that they've read that were really helpful, some source that was really helpful to them. All right, some further resources. I mentioned this at most talks, but examples of old student theses are available on the library's website. I think this is, a really great resource that is available. You can go to the elibrary.auca.kg and find them there under senior theses. You're going to have to log in, I believe, using your AUCA email, and then you'll have access to them. The resources for students page, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of stuff related to citation, which I was just talking about, to paraphrasing, which I was also just talking about. And also it has a number of guides for how to write literature reviews. And also, as I was mentioning earlier, examples that will be really helpful, I think. So our YouTube channel, as I always plug, includes writing resources. It will also include the recording of this talk very shortly. And then last but certainly not least, you are welcome to come to the work at any stage. Our writing tutors are specially trained in research skills. They might not be experts in your particular academic field, but they can help you with things like how to paraphrase, how to cite properly, how to find sources, and of course, they can help you with basic writing skills. So you can go to work.auca.kg to book a session, and I encourage you to do so sooner rather than later, because especially around deadlines, those sessions, they all get snapped up. And if you wait until the last minute, you might really regret it. Okay, so with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I know that this has been a bit long, so at this point, I'm going to stop screen sharing and close this presentation. And I'm going to open up for question and answer. Oh, one last thing I would mention, let me find the link, is that Maria reminded me that we just did a presentation on embedding quotes, how to use quotes in an elegant manner. And that might also be useful to you guys if you need to use some quotes in your literature review. So let me just pop the link to that in the chat as well. So if anyone has a question, if you could press the hand raise button, that would be great.
Yes, and don't be shy. I mean, if there was a lot of information in this workshop, so if we need at some point to go to the basics, and if you have a question as basic as what is even the point of the literature review, why is my professor making me do this, please feel free to ask it, because it's very important for us, obviously, to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So yeah, so any question, right, if any, however basic or however small, please ask it. Okay, if there's anything that you do not understand 100%, because we want you to leave this workshop feeling equipped, feeling like you can actually do it and you understand why you're doing this.
We do have a question in the chat. Is it possible to please somehow share the presentation? Yes, so this talk is being recorded, and shortly after it finishes, I will upload it to our YouTube page. I just put the link to our YouTube page, our YouTube channel, in the chat. This also has all of our other past workshops about academic writing. So it will be on there. It usually takes, a couple hours maybe to, render and load, etc. But it will be on there really soon. So if there was something that you want to look at again, or maybe your classmate missed it but wanted to see it, this is where it will be. Anything else?
I have a question about the peer tutors meeting. If we have to book a couple of meetings, does it have to be the same peer tutor, or not necessarily, to get the different approaches?
No,
you don't have to. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Maria.
Oh, I just wanted to say that there are pros and cons to this. Sometimes, it is beneficial to work with the same tutor, so you receive the continuity. So you don't have to explain to your to every new tutor what's going on. So if you are working on the same paper, let's say, right? It is also, but like Erica said, there is also an advantage of having different viewpoints, right? So, and also just sometimes it's as simple as that. Sometimes it just takes a while for people to find their tutor, the person that they're fully comfortable with, that they feel that person is giving them what they want. So I think that this decision we should be leaving entirely up to you.
Absolutely.
Okay,
I would
there's
just
no
briefly add, oh, sorry, I just briefly add that all of our writing tutors do take quite rigorous class about how to teach writing. And so all of them have that really strong foundation. So whoever you take a class with, I can assure you that it will be a quality tutoring session, and that they will be equipped to help you. Okay, someone asked in the chat, could you recommend any resource how to make annotation of some articles? So what do you mean? What do you mean exactly? Can you explain?
We just have we have just a task from Professor Tama to make annotation of 10 articles. So that's why we have to be sure what is the proper order of annotation and what may be just like a request for it.
So let me clarify, Elena. You do not mean an annotated bibliography. He wants you to annotate an article, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, basically, annotation is a way of carefully reading an article, right? So, so this is, as you are going through an article, you're saying, aha, this is the person's thesis, right? Or this is the main source that they're using. Or I think this is where the author is really disagreeing with, with whoever preceded him. Or you are saying, aha, this is the part where the author is describing the methodology, but I'm seeing some issues with that. So there is really no, how do you call it? No set kind of a sample for how to annotate an article. So what the professor wants you to do, what I think Tama wants is that he wants evidence that you are reading this article, right? And that you're thinking about it and that you're noticing the key points of this article. That is the purpose of this exercise, as far as I can understand. Okay, you might want to double check with him, but I think that this is, this is what's happening here. Because sometimes, how it is, sometimes people read something and they have no idea what it is that they're reading or what the main points are. And, and so he wants, that careful reading, and those comments on the side, the annotations, will help you identify what it is that you are reading.
But actually we made like a paraphrasing of these articles, and right now after making all paraphrasing of 10 articles, we have to make like, I don't know, is it kind of research, but it's just like should be shorter for, so the first task was from 250 to 300 words, but right now we have to make it shorter for 100 for each article.
I see. So he you to annotate the article, or he is asking you to summarize the article?
So annotate.
No, I think it's supposed to be the annotated bibliography of these 10 articles that we summarized before.
This is completely different. So you're not annotating the one article. You are doing an annotated bibliography. Yes, there is indeed a sample of an annotated bibliography on our resources page, and we are going to put it into a chat in just a second. Erica, can you get to it, or
Yeah,
shall I get to it? Yes. So Erica will put an example of an annotated bibliography in the in the chat. There is definitely a way to do that. So if you're not annotating one article, but if you're annotating several, or if you're doing a bibliography of several articles that you're annotating, there is definitely a model for that. So do you guys see this?
Should be in the chat.
It's in the chat.
Yes. I
So
can see
if you,
this.
yes, okay. So there is an Cornell University annotated bibliography guide there that you can use.
Any other
Any
questions?
other questions?
Thank you.
All right, well, if not, I just want to thank you guys again for attending. I hope this was helpful. Again, the recording will be on our YouTube page shortly, and I encourage you to look at the resources on our website, to look at the resources on our YouTube page. And of course, if you ever need help, there's always a place you can come. You can book a session with the work, and our tutors will be there to help you. So thank you all, and I hope you guys have a good evening. Bye-bye.